24 years ago, a 5-year-old boy vanished without a trace in Alabama on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, leaving his family shattered and the entire town plunged into confusion. Authorities initially suspected it was just a typical case of a missing child, but despite extensive searches, there was no body, no evidence of violence, and far too few clues, causing the investigation to gradually stall. Yet over all those years, the boy's parents never gave up hope, clinging to the slim possibility that their son was still alive somewhere, living a fate they couldn't see. Then one day, from a small modern detail that no one had noticed, a detail overlooked for years, the entire case was suddenly turned upside down in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you're interested in cases that seem long forgotten, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. The summer of 2001 in Alabama passed with the familiar sense of calm typical of small southern U.S. towns, where people still left doors ajar during the day. Kids played outside without constant adult supervision, and evening news rarely covered anything beyond traffic accidents or the weather. Oxford, in Calhoun County, was a place like that, small, orderly, uneventful, where families relied on each other through familiar faces and names, and the belief that bad things only happened far away. The Coleman family lived fully in that atmosphere, not wealthy but stable, not standout but well-liked by neighbors. David Coleman worked shifts at a manufacturing facility near town, while his wife Rebecca juggled family care and odd jobs to supplement income, their life revolving around a small house, dinners together, and quiet weekends with nothing special to tell. At the center of all family activities was Charles, their 5-year-old son, the only child, always carrying the light energy of childhood and an innocence that made adults easily forget. The outside world wasn't always kind. Charles wasn't a noisy or stubborn kid. He spoke softly, was obedient, smiled often, and tended to believe whatever adults said was true, a trait that made him beloved but also prompted Rebecca to occasionally remind him not to go with strangers, though those warnings always came in a context where even adults didn't truly believe danger could be close. Before the day of the incident, everything unfolded like any other summer day. Familiar routines, no arguments, no unusual signs in the family, and if there was anything different, it was so minor no one considered it noteworthy. The first unusual detail appeared not loudly or suddenly, but slipped in as part of everyday life, the presence of a familiar person or a face not entirely unfamiliar, enough to not trigger alarm, enough to not be immediately categorized as a dangerous stranger, like in child safety lessons. The initial reaction from surrounding adults wasn't fear but hesitation, then self-reassurance, because in a community where everyone knew each other, trust often won over suspicion. Charles, with his trusting nature and habit of obeying, had no reason to resist or question, and that very calmness allowed the critical moment to pass without leaving clear signs for witnesses. There were no cries for help, no struggle scenes, no images strong enough to etch into adult memories, just a short period when attention was diverted, when someone turned away believing everything was still fine. When the family realized Charles wasn't where he was supposed to be, the first feeling wasn't panic but confusion, a mild bewilderment that quickly turned to worry as waiting minutes stretched longer than usual. Rebecca called his name, David circled familiar areas. They told themselves maybe Charles was just absorbed in play somewhere, that he'd appear any moment, but each passing minute made those assumptions fragile. The spontaneous search began in tense silence, hurried footsteps, eyes scanning every familiar corner, every small path Charles frequented, and when no response came, worry turned to real panic. The family started asking neighbors, trying to piece together scattered bits of information from one person's memory or another's, but everything was vague. No one was sure what they'd seen. No one dared confirm anything. In that atmosphere, Rebecca realized they'd crossed the line of reasonable waiting, that this was no longer a situation resolvable by searching a few more minutes, and the decision to call police came, not after long deliberation, but in a moment when maternal instinct overrode old beliefs in the safety of the small town where they once thought tragedies like this would never happen. Rebecca Coleman's call was received less than 10 minutes after the family realized Charles was truly out of their control, and almost immediately, the peaceful rhythm of Oxford was interrupted by the arrival of patrol cars with flashing lights, a rare sight at the time that shifted the neighborhood's mood from confusion to clear tension. The first two officers from the Oxford Police Department arrived at the Coleman home in under half an hour, carrying the cautious demeanor familiar to those who'd handled plenty of lost child cases, but rarely faced the worst scenario. And from the very first questions, they tried to systematically reconstruct the last timeline when Charles was seen, even though initial information was just fragmented memories, imprecise, affected by the family's panicked state. The approach to the scene wasn't a strict lockdown like in serious crimes, because at that point, no one had enough basis to treat it as a clear abduction. The house showed no signs of disturbance, no unusual noises reported, no one saw a struggle or violent act, and everything seemed to fit a quiet disappearance, which often led investigators in small towns to lean more toward a child wandering off or going with someone familiar. The officers quickly separated David and Rebecca to take initial statements, asking details about Charles's habits, people who regularly interacted with the boy, familiar routes and locations he could reach on foot, while carefully noting any details related to strangers or acquaintances who appeared before the disappearance, though most such information was described in vague terms like maybe, possibly, I'm not sure. The preliminary assessment of the circumstances ran parallel to observing the surrounding area, from the yard, the front road, to familiar open spaces where kids often played, and the initial conclusion, though not officially stated, was that the scene showed no signs of immediate forcible act, a finding that briefly reassured the family, while inadvertently placing the case in a gray area of classification. In the preliminary report, the case was recorded as a missing child with unclear circumstances, not enough elements to classify as abduction, and that very lack of clarity directly influenced the initial investigative decisions made in the following hours. Instead of immediately deploying strong measures like blocking roads out of town or issuing widespread alerts, police focused on canvassing nearby areas, interviewing neighbors, family friends, and anyone who might have seen Charles that day, an approach fitting the most common scenario they'd encountered, a child lost in a familiar community. Officers split up to knock on doors in the neighborhood, asking nearly identical questions, trying to find a common point that could determine the boy's last direction. But the more statements collected, the fainter the overall picture became, as no witness was certain enough to confirm seeing Charles go where or with whom. In that context, initial investigative decisions balanced limited resources of a local police department with the need for quick response, prioritizing visible police presence in the area to both reassure the community and continue gathering information, rather than immediately activating federal mechanisms or widespread alerts. The unclear case classification forced investigators to constantly adjust assumptions, sometimes leaning toward Charles leaving on his own, sometimes considering he followed a trusted adult, but at that point, there wasn't enough data to elevate any hypothesis to top priority. Meanwhile, minutes passed in what experts later call the golden hours, witnessing key actions not yet deployed, no roadblocks on main routes out of Oxford, no Amber Alert activated to mobilize statewide attention, no urgent request for higher-level investigative support, all stemming from the belief the matter could still be resolved locally. These decisions weren't indifference or negligence, but the result of real-world experience and the social context of the time, when child abductions by strangers were considered rare and usually tied to clear violent signs, which were entirely absent in Charles's case. The Coleman family, meanwhile, stood between contrasting states, comforted on one hand by police's quick presence and reassurances that all possibilities were being considered, yet increasingly gripped by anxiety, on the other as they realized no one could say for sure where Charles was or when he'd return. Rebecca kept repeating small details she thought important, trying to ensure nothing was missed, while David, though outwardly calmer, couldn't hide his tension seeing time pass without concrete answers. For investigators, these first hours were a phase of gathering information, while shaping investigative thinking, and in that phase, strategic choices, made with the best intentions, inadvertently created gaps that later proved hard to fill. As night fell over Oxford, the initial investigation was fully activated with files, reports, and an ever-growing witness list. But at the same time, the vague sense of the case's true nature still enveloped everything, leaving an unanswered question: was Charles Coleman simply a child who wandered off on a summer afternoon, or the victim of something more serious that no one recognized in those critical first hours? As the first hours of the investigation passed without clear leads, the Oxford police focus gradually shifted to the most critical task in any child disappearance: reconstructing as accurately as possible the final timeline before Charles Coleman vanished. Because in the absence of physical evidence or direct witnesses, time became the only remaining clue. Investigators returned to the Coleman family, not to seek emotions, but to peel apart every small detail in their daily routine, repeatedly asking about things that seemed too familiar to hold anything unusual. From the hour Charles woke up that morning, what he ate, who he played with, to the exact moment each family member last saw him, Rebecca, in a state of exhaustion and tension, tried to recall every moment, but her memories were constantly interrupted by emotions, making answers often start with certainty and end in hesitation, while David, though trying to stay calm, realized details he'd once deemed unimportant were now pieces that could decide the entire investigation's direction. Information gathering didn't stop at immediate family, but extended to those regularly connected to Charles, from neighbors, family friends, to anyone who might have interacted with him that day. And here, investigators began facing a familiar but challenging reality. Each person remembered a different version of the same afternoon, with no memory fully matching another. In efforts to identify the last person to see Charles, police sifted through numerous statements, many conflicting on seemingly minor details like the boy's exact location, the time he appeared, or which adult was nearby, and each conflict not only complicated the file, but made reconstructing events more fragile. Some claimed to have seen Charles near home early afternoon, others remembered him leaving the area sooner, while some statements only went as far as "I think I saw," without specific confirmation, forcing investigators to question memory reliability. Amid collective panic, when timelines were placed side by side on a whiteboard in the police department's temporary meeting room, a worrying gap emerged, a time frame long enough that no one could say for sure where Charles was or what he was doing, a gap uncovered by any statement strong enough to be deemed reliable. This gap, though only spanning tens of minutes, held decisive meaning, as it was the period when anything could have happened without trace, and the more they tried to narrow it, the more investigators realized each effort revealed new contradictions. Some witnesses, when questioned again, began altering details, not intentionally hiding, but because they were influenced by information heard from others, neighbors, or hurried sidewalk talks, blending personal memory with collective speculation. This posed a major challenge for the investigation: how to distinguish what truly happened from what was merely distorted memory shaped by time and emotion. Identifying the last person to see Charles thus became not a simple question, but a complex elimination process, where each mentioned name had to be contextualized by specific time, location, and actual contact with the boy. Some initially seeming key witnesses faded when cross-checked against other data, while minor details from seemingly unimportant accounts prompted careful notes because they didn't fully fit initial assumptions. Contradictions appeared not just between witnesses, but within individual statements, as they tried adjusting answers to better match what they thought police wanted, a familiar psychological phenomenon, but especially dangerous early in a disappearance. For investigators, reconstructing events now resembled assembling a puzzle with most pieces worn or distorted, each bearing traces of emotion and guesswork, making the final image hard to achieve needed clarity. These difficulties became clearer when police tried placing Charles's timeline in the broader neighborhood context that afternoon, comparing his movements to community routines, from adult schedules to other kids' play habits. But even this approach yielded more inferential than confirmatory conclusions. Each timeline adjustment required re-examining the entire sequence, and in that process, investigators realized reconstructing wasn't just a logic puzzle, but a battle against uncertainty, where no answer fully satisfied. The Coleman family, witnessing this, placed hope in police meticulousness, while torn by guilt over not providing clearer information, and each repeated question about timing or actions made them question minor decisions that day. By day's end, though the timeline board was filled with notes, arrows and question marks, the clearest outcome was the existence of a key gap no one could explain, a gap every hypothesis passed through, but none could stand firm against data shortage. In that context, investigators had to admit reconstructing Charles's final timeline, instead of bringing clarity, exposed how fragile their knowledge was, and that any error in this phase, however small, could lead them far from the truth they sought. The unfillable gap in Charles's final timeline forced the investigators to move away from the realm of subjective accounts and turn to the only thing that could still speak somewhat more objectively, the physical space where the boy had last been seen, because when human memory becomes hazy, the scene, though silent, still has the ability to retain traces that time has not yet erased. The search area was therefore expanded beyond the immediate boundaries of the Coleman home, encompassing all the familiar routes that Charles might have taken on a normal afternoon. From the small road in front of the house, the shortcuts between residential areas, to vacant lots, grassy fields, and the spots where kids in town often gathered to play. Officers walked sections on foot, examining the ground, bushes, road edges, and any spot that could obscure visibility, while other teams swept farther routes that a 5-year-old would be unlikely to reach on his own without adult guidance. And it was this very expansion that began to yield the first discoveries, though they were not as clear-cut as what one typically sees in violent crimes. One of the items linked to Charles was found not in the most obvious place, but in a spot slightly off the route he usually took. A small detail, but enough to make the investigators pause longer than usual. Because if Charles had voluntarily left the familiar area, he must have had a reason, and if someone had led him away, then this change in direction could not have been random. The discovery of additional items, though few and without obvious signs of damage, further heightened the sense that what had happened did not entirely fit the scenario of a child simply wandering off while playing, because these objects appeared as if they had been left behind intentionally, rather than dropped during unconscious movement. Each item was documented, photographed, and marked with its exact location, not because they held significant forensic value on their own, but because the spatial relationship between them might reveal a sequence of events that human testimony could not provide. The investigators spent time assessing the investigative value of each object, asking basic but crucial questions. Did this belong to Charles? In what circumstances did he usually carry it? And what did its presence here say about the boy's final actions? In the process, they realized there were no signs of struggle or destruction, no blood or torn fabric, the kinds of things commonly seen in violent abductions, but this unusual cleanliness raised suspicions that if human intervention had occurred, it had been controlled enough, gentle enough, to leave no obvious traces. The distribution of the items, when plotted on a map, did not form a straight line or a random trajectory, but suggested a turning point where Charles seemed to have deviated from his usual path to head in a different direction, and the question arose whether he had made that decision himself or someone else was behind the change. Small signs like undisturbed ground, grass not trampled unusually, or items lying neatly rather than scattered, all made it hard for investigators to accept the hypothesis that Charles had panicked or fled, because a frightened 5-year-old's behavior typically leaves far more chaotic traces. Instead, the scene evoked the image of a process that unfolded in relative calm, where the boy did not feel threatened enough to resist or try to attract attention, a detail consistent with the trusting and obedient personality the family had previously described. However, assessing the scene was not without inherent difficulties, because this area was not an isolated space, but part of everyday community life, where many people passed through during the day, making it nearly impossible to distinguish traces directly related to Charles from ordinary activity marks. Every neighbor's footprint, every tire track on the road, every broken branch could have been there before or after Charles disappeared, and there was no way to precisely date them in that context. For this reason, investigators had to rely more on logical inference from the position and condition of the items, rather than expecting clear scientific evidence. The more they analyzed, the more they realized the scene did not provide a direct answer, but only raised more difficult questions. If Charles had not wandered off on his own, then who had caused him to leave the familiar route? And why could that person do so without leaving signs of coercion? If there was human intervention, why were the items left in this way? And was it the result of a hasty decision or a deliberate act? These questions not only revolved around Charles' behavior, but also drew attention to the surrounding social environment, where the line between acquaintance and stranger was not always clear, and where community trust could become a factor that lowered vigilance. For the Coleman family, seeing their son's items removed from the search area and placed in evidence bags was an experience that brought both hope that the investigation was progressing and fear that each found object meant Charles was somewhere out of their reach. The investigators, meanwhile, had to maintain a balance between extracting maximum informational value from the scene and not over-interpreting ambiguous signs, because any hasty conclusion could cause them to overlook other possibilities. As the scene expansion gradually reached the practical limits of resources and time, the overall picture that emerged still lacked a key point that could connect everything: the items, their locations, and the previously identified timeline gap. And it was this absence that made the scene, despite thorough sweeping, feel like a puzzle with too many pieces that did not fit together. The questions arising from the scene thus concerned not only where Charles had gone, but also how the incident had unfolded, raising doubts that this was not simply an accident or random wandering, but possibly the result of a sequence of actions involving someone else, even though those actions had been carried out discreetly enough to leave no clear traces in those critical early hours. The fact that the scene provided no clear answer forced the investigators to return to the only remaining data source that could fill the increasingly alarming gaps in the file: human accounts, even though everyone understood that this was the most fragile type of evidence, the most easily influenced and hardest to verify, especially in a small community that had just suffered the psychological shock of realizing a child could vanish in broad daylight. Witnesses did not appear all at once, but emerged gradually in waves. Some came to the police just hours after hearing the news, some the next day, and others took several days to come forward, when the guilt of maybe having seen something began to overpower initial hesitation. Each statement received carried the hope that it would be the missing piece, but also the risk of making an already tangled picture even more complicated. In the initial interviews, investigators quickly realized there was no consistency in descriptions of any person or vehicle that might have been involved around the time Charles disappeared, and the differences were not just in minor details but appeared in the most core elements. Some witnesses insisted they had seen a man standing near the area Charles frequented, but the described age varied significantly, from middle-aged to very young, while others emphasized they only remembered a vague figure without being able to determine gender or facial features. When it came to vehicles, the contradictions were even more pronounced, with accounts of different colors, different styles, and even some witnesses believing it was a familiar neighborhood vehicle, while others were certain it was one they had never seen before. The investigators did not rush to dismiss any statement, because they knew that in chaotic circumstances, the truth rarely appears as a complete story, but is often fragmented across multiple people's memories. However, working with so many mismatched versions made verification grueling, as each new statement forced them to revisit all previously collected information to look for intersections, if any existed. The impact of community panic quickly revealed itself as a serious distorting factor, because news of Charles spread not only through official channels, but also through everyday conversations, where details were embellished, speculation presented as fact, and fear acted as a catalyst that unconsciously altered human memory. Many witnesses, when questioned again, began adjusting their accounts, not because they wanted to mislead the investigation, but because they themselves could no longer distinguish what they had actually seen from what they had heard from others afterward. Investigators noticed that the level of certainty in some people's statements increased over time, a typical sign that memory had been reinforced by external stories, rather than direct experience. This was especially dangerous because confident and coherent accounts are often more readily believed, even when inaccurate. Verifying information thus involved not only cross-checking statements against the few objective facts, but also psychologically assessing each witness, considering the context in which they provided information, their motive for coming forward, and the degree to which they were influenced by surrounding public opinion. Some witnesses initially offered only a small detail, but after receiving police attention, unconsciously expanded their story, adding elements they thought would help, making initial and later statements inconsistent. Conversely, there were those who were hesitant and uncertain, but that very hesitation often reflected a higher degree of honesty, as they were willing to admit what they did not clearly remember. Investigators had to walk a thin line between extracting maximum information from witnesses and not getting swept up in appealing but unsubstantiated details, because every mistaken assumption formed from inaccurate testimony could send the entire investigation off course. The difficulty in verification also stemmed from many witnesses remembering events only in relative terms, such as early afternoon or after lunch, timeframes too broad to precisely place in an already gap-filled timeline. When investigators tried to narrow these down by probing deeper, they often received answers that were more speculative than confirmatory, as the witnesses themselves had to rely on their daily routines to estimate time rather than recall it specifically. This created a paradox: the more thoroughly they asked, the more data they got, but accuracy did not increase accordingly. In the investigation team's workspace, noteboards quickly filled with arrows, question marks and marginal notes, reflecting the relentless effort to find a common denominator among the statements. But every time a seemingly fitting detail was placed at the center, at least one other statement emerged to contradict it. The existence of multiple parallel versions of the truth forced investigators to accept that, at this stage, they could not determine which story was correct, but could only eliminate those that were definitely wrong, a slow process that provided no clear sense of progress. Meanwhile, the Coleman family faced a different paradox. Every new statement reported to them sparked hope that Charles had been seen somewhere, but when those statements were disproved or unverifiable, that hope quickly turned to despair, creating an emotional cycle that exhausted them. Investigators were acutely aware of this impact but could not stop gathering information, because any detail, no matter how vague, could be the key to a new direction. The overlap of information, combined with pressure from the community and local media, forced the investigation team to continually adjust interview strategies, both to avoid further contaminating witness memories and to not miss valuable details. At a certain point, they had to acknowledge that they could not rely entirely on human accounts to reconstruct the truth, because those accounts had been too distorted by emotion, time, and the desire to help. Yet dealing with multiple versions of the truth was unavoidable, and it was within the maze of those conflicting statements that investigators began to clearly sense that Charles's disappearance was not just an investigative puzzle, but also a harsh lesson about the limits of human memory in crisis situations, where the truth does not vanish but becomes buried under so many layers of emotion and speculation that it is almost impossible to reach through conventional methods. The overlap of conflicting statements in the early days not only slowed the investigation's progress, but also created an invisible pressure, forcing the police to seek a central assumption to temporarily anchor all their efforts. Because an investigation cannot operate effectively if every possibility remains equally weighted for too long. The detail that misdirected the initial assessment did not appear as clear evidence, but as the convergence of several factors that seemed reasonable when placed together. The lack of signs of violence at the scene, Charles's items found in nearly intact condition, and statements from some witnesses suggesting the boy might have voluntarily left the familiar area for a short time. When these factors were combined, they gradually formed an implicit assumption that the worst-case scenario, namely abduction by a stranger, might not be the priority to focus on immediately, at least in the early stage. This assumption was not officially declared, but it seeped into how investigators asked questions, the order of prioritized actions, and how resources were allocated, causing the possibility that Charles had been deliberately taken by someone to gradually be pushed below less dangerous scenarios in investigative thinking. In that context, the abduction possibility did not disappear from the file, but it was no longer the focus dominating every decision, becoming instead a remote option, retained only to be considered if other directions yielded no results. Reducing priority for this hypothesis led to a clear shift in investigative focus, as police spent more time searching for signs that Charles might have left the area on his own, gotten lost, or encountered an incident unrelated to organized criminal behavior. Rather than concentrating on tracing possibilities involving an adult intervening in the boy's disappearance, sweeps began to lean more toward checking areas a 5-year-old could reach without supervision, routes leading to natural areas or public spaces, and cross-referencing Charles's daily habits to see if he might have gone farther than usual unnoticed. These decisions, in the short term, gave the impression that the investigation was progressing logically and under control, as they were based on available data and aligned with experience handling child disappearances not uncommon in the local environment. However, this surface reasonableness obscured the hidden risks of placing too much trust in an unfully verified assumption, as every passing hour, without stronger action on the abduction possibility, meant critical tracing opportunities could be missed. The short-term decisions made during this phase, such as focusing resources on local search activities, rather than expanding the scope toward pursuing a suspect, or delaying widespread alerts to avoid alarming the community, all stemmed from a desire to resolve the case quickly within the local area, but also reflected a belief that the situation remained under control. Those choices, in retrospect, were not the result of negligence or irresponsibility, but products of the social and professional context at the time, where child abductions by strangers were considered rare, and usually accompanied by much clearer signs than what was present in Charles's case. However, the long-term consequences of this misdirected assumption gradually became evident, as the prioritized investigative directions yielded no concrete results, while the downgraded possibilities became increasingly difficult to revisit effectively. With each passing day, potential leads related to someone else intervening in Charles's disappearance grew fainter, not only due to time, but also because of the lack of timely actions to preserve and exploit them in the early stage. The shift in investigative focus also directly affected how witnesses were interviewed and evaluated, as statements suggesting the presence of a stranger or unfamiliar vehicle were not placed at the center, but often treated as secondary details, needing further verification before they could influence the case's overall direction. This created a dangerous feedback loop, where information that could point to a more serious scenario was not thoroughly exploited, thereby further reinforcing belief in the current assumption's reasonableness, making course correction increasingly difficult. For the Coleman family, this shift manifested in how they were updated, as conversations with police gradually focused more on local search and sweep activities than on questions about the possibility someone had taken Charles, a development that both offered hope their child might be nearby and inadvertently reduced psychological preparation for a worse scenario. The investigators, meanwhile, faced pressure to both resolve the case quickly and maintain community trust and law enforcement capabilities, and in trying to balance these goals, they chose the path least disruptive in the short term, even though no one could fully foresee the long-term consequences of that choice. When subsequent days brought no breakthrough, signs that the initial assumption might not be entirely accurate began to appear. But changing investigative direction at that point had become far more complicated than doing so from the start, because resources had been allocated, hypotheses built, and the team's overall mindset partly shaped by prior decisions. The long-term impact of the wrong assumption lay not only in missing early investigative opportunities, but also in creating a mental inertia that caused every new piece of data to be interpreted within the existing framework, rather than evaluated independently. In that context, any information not fitting the current assumption risked being downplayed or set aside, not because it was unimportant, but because it did not fit the story the investigation was telling about Charles's disappearance. This misalignment between what might have happened and what the investigation believed had happened gradually created a dangerous gap, where the truth, if it existed, became increasingly harder to access over time. And although at that moment, no one in the investigative team could confidently assert they had taken the wrong path, the short-term decisions based on an insufficiently solid assumption had begun to shape a trajectory where turning back would require more than just a new lead. It would demand a willingness to admit that the foundation of those first steps might have been wrong from the beginning. The silent consequences of the flawed investigative assumption began to reveal themselves clearly as time passed without any substantial progress, forcing the authorities to expand their efforts in the most tangible direction available to them at that moment. A large-scale search operation, deployed not only as an investigative measure, but also as a way to reassure the Coleman family and the increasingly anxious community. The Oxford Police Department quickly mobilized additional personnel from neighboring units, coordinating with rescue teams, firefighters, and local volunteer groups, who were willing to set aside their daily routines to join the search for a child many of them had never met, yet felt connected to simply because he belonged to this town. The search areas were divided into sections on maps, carefully marking the places already covered and those needing priority, from the dense forests surrounding the residential area, nearby streams and ponds, to vacant lots, abandoned parking areas, and industrial zones with little foot traffic. Routes leading to interstate highways were also checked, though under the current investigative assumption, the likelihood of Charles reaching those areas on his own was considered lower than the possibility of him getting lost in the immediate vicinity. The search teams worked in shifts, moving slowly over every meter of ground, calling Charles's name, turning over every rock, checking every bush, with the slim hope that they would find some trace, even the smallest one, that could explain what had happened. In the early days of the operation, the atmosphere still carried determination and belief that results would come if the effort was great enough, as many believed a 5-year-old child could not vanish completely without leaving a trace in such a limited space. However, as the search area expanded further with still zero results, exhaustion began to show on the faces of both professional forces and volunteers, and the hard-to-accept reality gradually seeped into the collective awareness that the search might not be as straightforward as they had thought. Ponds were dived into, shallow water areas were thoroughly scanned, but no biological evidence confirming Charles's presence was found, no clothing, no bodily traces, nothing strong enough to support the hypothesis that he had met with an accident in the natural environment. Abandoned industrial zones and warehouses were checked with utmost caution, but the results were only empty spaces, carrying a chilling sense of hopelessness rather than investigative leads. Each time a large area was marked as searched, the psychological pressure increased, as it meant another possibility had been ruled out without providing any answers. For the investigators, the absence of authentic biological evidence was both a positive signal and a worrying sign. Positive, because it reduced the likelihood that Charles had met harm within the search area, but worrying because it suggested he might have left this perimeter very early on, in a way that the current search operation could not reach. However, adjusting the strategy in that context was far from easy, as resources had been poured into on-site searching, and expanding in other directions would require admitting that the recent large efforts might have been misdirected. Time passing not only blurred potential physical traces, but also eroded the morale of participants, as each day ending without new news chipped away a little more at hope. The Coleman family, witnessing groups of people coming and going from the search areas without results, had to face a painful reality. The massive presence of forces did not mean the truth was getting closer. Rebecca still clung to every word of encouragement, every announcement that this or that area was being scanned, while David grew increasingly silent, as if each day without finding Charles deepened a sense of helplessness he could not put into words. For the community, the initial search campaign created a rare wave of unity, but as days turned into weeks without results, fatigue and disappointment began to replace enthusiasm, and the number of volunteers gradually decreased, not because they stopped caring, but because they no longer knew what more they could do. The investigators realized they were approaching the point where every subsequent action would be repetitive, as thoroughly searched areas no longer held potential for new leads, and unsearched areas lay outside the reasonable scope of the current assumption. The deadlock began to form not as a sudden event, but as a slow process, as one direction after another was closed off without opening any new replacement. Internal meetings increasingly focused on reassessment rather than planning, with investigators reviewing the list of completed activities and realizing that, though the search scale was unprecedented for this small town, the results achieved were not commensurate with the effort expended. The lack of authentic biological evidence, clear physical traces, and new witness leads caused the case file to gradually fall into a state where any next step would require a fundamental shift in approach, something not always possible amid the mounting pressure and expectations. As the large-scale search operation gradually scaled down and shifted to a maintenance phase, a heavy feeling enveloped the entire investigation process, as everyone understood that if Charles was not found during this phase, the chances of locating him would diminish over time, not only because traces faded, but also because resource and community attention would gradually shift to other matters. It was in that moment, though no one said it officially, that many involved in the investigation began to sense they were facing a dead end, where every tangible search effort had been deployed without yielding answers, and where the question, "Where did Charles Coleman go?" hung in the air, heavier than ever, as a reminder that some cases, despite being pursued with all goodwill and available resources, could slip from the grasp of justice right from the earliest decisive days. The sense of deadlock enveloping after the large-scale search did not arrive in a specific moment, but accumulated gradually through increasingly shorter internal meetings, increasingly repetitive reports, and the unavoidable truth that all tangible efforts had been deployed without yielding new leads, forcing the Oxford Police Department to confront a decision that was administrative in nature but carried particularly heavy psychological weight, changing the status of Charles Coleman's missing person file. This decision was not made in a single meeting, but formed through a prolonged evaluation process, where commanders reviewed what had been done, what had not been done, and what could no longer be done, within the framework of local resources, leading to the conclusion that maintaining the case in active investigation status no longer reflected reality. On paper, changing the file status was merely a procedure, but in practice, it marked the boundary between the active search phase and the passive waiting phase, where the case was not completely closed, but no longer prioritized in the way the family and community had hoped. Along with this decision, all evidence collected in the early days, from items related to Charles to interview documents and search maps, was sealed and placed into storage per protocol, a necessary step to preserve the file's integrity, but one that also created the feeling that everything had been neatly filed away into the drawer of the past. Sealing the evidence did not mean it had lost value, but reflected the reality that at that time, no additional methods or tools at the local level could extract further information from them, turning them into dormant evidence, awaiting different circumstances in the future. For the investigators who had been attached to the case from the beginning, this moment carried a mixture of relief and remorse. Relief because the daily pressure of a stalled investigation was finally eased, but remorse because they knew changing the status did not mean the question had been answered. The Coleman family was officially informed in a private meeting, where police representatives explained that the case would remain on the list of unsolved cases and would be reviewed if new information emerged. A technical phrasing that could hardly soothe the pain of those who had waited for weeks and hoped that each passing day would bring news of Charles. For Rebecca and David, this announcement did not feel like a conclusion but like an indefinite suspension, where they were not told what had happened to their son, yet no longer promised that tomorrow more people would be searching. The shift from active investigation to cold case status was thus dual-natured. It kept the case from being legally forgotten, but pushed it out of the center of practical attention. At the local level, this meant resources were reallocated to new cases, other emergency calls, daily responsibilities that could not be postponed, and Charles's disappearance, though never considered closed, gradually became a file mentioned less in routine meetings. The investigation's pause was not abandonment, but in the practical operations of a small agency, it meant no more search teams moving through the neighborhood, no more continuous interviews with neighbors, and no more late nights with maps and note-covered walls. Silence began to envelop the space that had once been the center of attention. As local media coverage gradually decreased, the community returned to daily life, and whispered stories about the disappearance gave way to other concerns. For the police, archiving a cold case file was a way of acknowledging present limitations, and acceptance that not every question could be answered immediately, especially without new evidence, reliable witnesses, or technology powerful enough to exploit what had been collected. However, this acceptance did not mean complete forgetting, as the file was still retained, marked and organized for future access, though no one could say for sure when or under what circumstances that might happen. The Coleman family, meanwhile, had to face a different kind of silence, the absence of regular update calls, announcements that this or that area was being searched, and the feeling that time was moving toward bringing them closer to answers. This silence was not the end of pain, but a change in its form, where hope was no longer nourished by concrete actions, but existed only as a fragile belief that someday something would change. In that context, the administrative decision to change the file status became a quiet but profound milestone, not marked by ceremony or public announcement, but by documents being reorganized, evidence being put away, and the case falling into a prolonged waiting state. The enveloping silence was not just the absence of noise or activity, but the absence of answers, a void similar to the one that had appeared in Charles's final timeline, but now extended to the entire investigation. And while for the system, the case had been classified to fit operational reality, for the Coleman family and those who had participated in the search, Charles Coleman becoming a cold case was not the end of the story, but the moment the story stopped being told publicly, quietly drifting into a dormant phase, where time continued to pass, but the question about the 5-year-old boy who vanished on a summer afternoon in Alabama remained unanswered, lying quietly in the sealed file, awaiting a change that no one at that time could envision. The silence enveloping the file in Alabama did not mean time stopped flowing, for while Charles Coleman's case gradually settled in the cold storage of the local police system, elsewhere, hundreds of miles from Oxford, a life continued to grow, develop, and adapt under a different name, a different story, utterly unaware that its true origins had been severed in the earliest years. Many years after the disappearance, that 5-year-old boy had become an adult living in an environment completely alien to Alabama, with no clear memories of the small town, the familiar streets, or the faces tied to his initial childhood. That new life, viewed from the outside, did not bear the marks of an obvious tragedy, as the man carrying the current identity had a stable job, a sufficient social circle, and a personal history, documented on legal papers. But beneath the surface lay a lingering emptiness, a hard-to-name lack of connection, that he himself could not explain rationally. Growing up in a different family, in a different location, he always sensed an invisible distance between himself and those around him, not because of mistreatment, but because questions about himself never had complete answers. His personal records, though administratively legal, lacked details most people take for granted, such as stories from the earliest years, the first family memories, or extended relatives, all vague or recounted indirectly, as if built from others' narratives, rather than personal experience. This deficit in personal origin data did not cause immediate issues when young, but over time, as he began questioning himself, it gradually became a prolonged psychological instability, making him feel perpetually on the sidelines of his own life story. These feelings did not manifest as extreme behavior or clear disorders, but existed as fragmented pieces, unexplained discomfort when hearing childhood stories, a sense of alienation looking at old family photos, or a vague sadness whenever filling forms requiring birthplace and origin family information. Over many years, he learned to live with those voids, treating them as a normal part of himself, though deep inside there always lingered a feeling that something did not fit, that the identity he carried did not fully reflect his true self. These psychological instabilities were not strong enough to prompt professional help, but sufficient to affect how he built relationships, often keeping distance, struggling to open up fully, and always preparing for things to change unexpectedly. Over time, some identity discrepancies became clearer, not as concrete evidence, but as small details that did not align when placed together, such as inconsistencies in old documents, childhood stories told in varying versions, or a feeling of not belonging to the place said to be his hometown. These signs were not enough to make him doubt his entire life, but sufficient to create a foundation of unease, where he always felt the need to prove himself more than others, as if compensating for something lost that he could not name. On a deeper level, vague memories occasionally surfaced in dreams or unconscious moments, disjointed images of spaces, sounds or sensations that could not tie to any specific memory in his current life, further heightening the sense that his past had layers covered over. He might not clearly remember who he once was, but his body and mind seemed to carry traces of an early rupture, a transition he was never explained. The existence of these discrepant signs did not lead to specific action over many years, as he had learned to accept that some questions have no answers, and digging into them might bring more instability than clarity. However, that acceptance also meant living a life parallel to his own past, one built on what was given to him rather than what he chose, where voids were not filled with truth but with silence. While Charles Coleman's cold case file lay dormant in Alabama storage, marked unsolved and awaiting some condition to reopen, the man with the different identity continued to live, work, and age, carrying within him a nameless question, a sense of misalignment with himself that he never had the chance to confront directly. That life was not a string of obvious tragic days, but neither was it wholly complete, as it was built on a foundation of absence, where the most critical pieces of personal identity had been detached very early. And though he knew nothing of the name Charles Coleman, nothing of Oxford, or the afternoon in 2001 that changed everything, his very existence, with its simmering instabilities and inexplicable discrepant signs, unwittingly became living proof that a case does not continue only in investigative files, but also in the victim's life, in ways more silent and enduring than anyone could recognize at the moment the case fell into silence. The prolonged silence surrounding his origins, which had been accepted as an unchangeable part of life, began to crack when the man carrying his current identity realized that the simmering unease of many years was no longer just a vague feeling, but was gradually crystallizing into specific doubts about his very self. His personal records, though sufficient to exist legally in society, contained inconsistencies that he had previously overlooked, but now became harder than ever to ignore. From mismatched timelines in old documents to sketchy details about his birthplace and initial guardians, recorded as if they were filled in, merely to complete procedures rather than to reflect the truth. When comparing these documents with the family stories he had heard throughout his childhood, he realized that there were gaps that could not be explained merely by oversights or ordinary administrative errors. As they repeated consistently across multiple sources, creating the sense that an important part of his personal history had been concealed or replaced. The lack of blood relatives further intensified those doubts, as he noticed that, unlike most people around him, he had no clear biological ties to the family he grew up with. No stories about distant relatives, no naturally mentioned genetic traits, and no shared memories of people who existed before he appeared in their lives. The questions about the past, which had once been suppressed out of fear of disrupting fragile stability, now began to rise more forcefully, not just as fleeting thoughts, but as demands needing answers, because he realized that continuing to live without understanding where he came from was gradually becoming a psychological burden he could no longer carry. Those questions went beyond legal identity and touched on deeper aspects of himself, such as why he always felt out of place during family occasions, why he reacted strongly to images or sounds of unclear origin, and why the feeling of not belonging anywhere had followed him for years like a shadow. The urge to investigate his origins, therefore, did not come as a spontaneous decision, but as the result of a long accumulation, where each small inconsistency pushed him closer to facing the truth, even though he did not yet know what that truth would look like. At first, he only tried searching for basic information, reviewing old documents, asking cautious questions to close relatives, but each vague or evasive answer only reinforced the feeling that something was being hidden. The ultimate trigger for seeking the truth was not a major discovery or specific evidence, but a moment of realization, when he saw that the prolonged unease had begun directly affecting how he viewed himself and his future, making it impossible to continue postponing confrontation with the growing doubts in his mind. He understood that investigating his origins could lead to conclusions that were hard to accept, even shattering current relationships, but he also realized that doing nothing meant accepting a perpetual state of limbo, where he existed but did not truly know who he was. The doubts about himself thus could no longer be set aside, but became a quiet driving force, pushing him to begin the journey of seeking answers, even though that journey had no clear shape or defined destination. In the process, he had to face the fear that what he found might not fit the image of the life he had built, but he also felt a strange relief in finally allowing himself to ask questions, because acknowledging that something was wrong was the first step in breaking the silence that had lasted for many years. These doubts did not immediately bring clarity, but they marked an important inner shift, from unconscious acceptance to conscious seeking, from living with gaps to determinedly filling them with truth, no matter how difficult that truth might be. And while in Alabama, the cold case file remained quietly in storage, no one knew that elsewhere, the victim of the long-ago disappearance had begun asking the first questions that would lead him away from a life built on incomplete pieces, closer to confronting a past he had never known, but that had always silently existed in every off-kilter feeling within himself. The doubts freshly stirred in the heart of the man carrying a different identity did not immediately lead to answers, but quietly coexisted alongside the continuing rhythm of life, much like how time had silently passed since the day Charles Coleman disappeared without any explanation. The victim from years ago, now grown, continued building his life along the familiar paths of a normal adult, working, maintaining social relationships, facing everyday responsibilities and anxieties, but always carrying the sense that a part of himself was never truly touched. That life did not collapse for lack of answers, but it was not truly complete either, as every major milestone occurred against a backdrop of absence, where questions about personal origins were set aside to make room for survival and adaptation. Meanwhile, in Alabama, the disappearance case of Charles Coleman gradually faded from collective memory, not because it was resolved, but because time and new events kept emerging, capturing the attention of the community and the legal system. The case file remained quietly in storage, classified, numbered, and archived according to procedure, but rarely opened except during routine formal reviews, when new investigators were required to familiarize themselves with old cases to understand local history. Those pages, once filled with the hopes and fears of an entire town, now became silent sheets, carrying the untold story of a child who had vanished, but no longer had the power to spur action in the present. Charles's biological family, who had once lived hour by hour in a state of waiting and hope, were also gradually worn down by the prolonged silence, as each passing year without new information made fragile faith harder to maintain. They continued keeping mementos, old photos, memories of a 5-year-old boy with his laughter and little habits, but gradually learned to live with the possibility that they might never know what really happened. The loss of hope did not come as a clear surrender, but as a slow psychological adjustment, where they no longer expected calls from police or breakthrough news, only trying to maintain daily life while carrying wordless pain. For the investigative system, prolonged silence was a familiar state for cold cases, where no new leads meant no new actions, and the case existed only as a theoretical possibility mentioned when special conditions arose. The investigators, originally involved, gradually retired or transferred, carrying personal memories of an unsolved case, while successors knew it only through files without strong enough emotional ties to push them to dig deeper amid lacking new information. Time, in this case, did not heal wounds, but only made them more familiar, causing the victim, the biological family, and the legal system to learn to live with the absence of answers. The man with the different identity, though beginning to become aware of doubts about himself, still lacked the conditions or motivation to turn them into concrete action, as current life demanded stability, and digging into the past could shake that fragile foundation. He continued existing in limbo, where identity questions were kept as private thoughts, unshared and unresolved, while the file in Alabama remained still, awaiting an external factor strong enough to break the prolonged quiet. Charles's biological family, with each passing year, had to face the reality that memories of the boy were fading in the community, as people who once knew about the case moved away, passed on, or simply stopped mentioning it, and that silence was sometimes more painful than the initial grief, as it carried the sense that their loss was no longer acknowledged or shared. In that context, the Charles Coleman case became a typical example of how time can dissolve a personal tragedy into the flow of larger events, not because it was less important, but because there was no longer enough momentum to sustain collective attention. The prolonged silence enveloped not only the file, but also the lives connected to it, creating a false stasis where everything seemed settled, but was actually frozen in the absence of truth. And while no one in Alabama could know that the victim of the long-ago disappearance was still living elsewhere under a different identity, that very existence, though not yet recognized, quietly challenged the prolonged silence, showing that the case had never truly ended, but was only waiting for the right moment to be pulled from oblivion, when time, instead of continuing to cover it, would finally become the factor connecting lives separated for more than 2 decades. As life continued flowing, in a state of limbo between acceptance and doubt, the man carrying a different identity gradually realized that the gaps in his personal records were not only causing psychological unease, but also creating very real risks in accessing long-term health care, especially when doctors began asking about genetic medical history that he could not clearly provide. During a preventive health consultation, he was recommended to take a consumer DNA test to identify potential risk factors, a suggestion purely medical, unrelated to tracing identity or past, and thus it did not encounter the hesitation he had felt in previous moments when considering investigating his origins, only to pull back. Submitting the DNA sample happened quietly, without great expectations, as for him it was simply a necessary step to better understand his body, not to confront the questions he had been postponing for years. When the results came back, the first part he looked at was the general health analysis, but it was the genetic relatives section that made him pause longer than expected, as the list of identified distant relatives did not match any of the family stories he had ever heard. Unfamiliar names, locations never appearing in his personal memories, and match levels high enough to rule out coincidence, meant he could not simply dismiss them as minor details. The unease that had existed vaguely was now pinpointed into a specific doubt when he realized these genetic connections clustered around an area with which he had no administrative or social ties, something hard to explain if his current identity records were complete and accurate. While he was still trying to interpret the meaning of those numbers and charts, the consumer DNA system had automatically flagged his profile as a case with an unusual match, as inconsistencies between biological data and declared personal information were what the algorithms were designed to detect. No direct alert or special notification was sent to him, but deeper in the system, this data was marked for attention in case of cross-referencing with missing persons or unidentified identity files. When he proactively contacted one of the listed distant relatives, the initial exchange, though polite and cautious, led to a troubling common conclusion. The other side could also find no reasonable family connection to explain the genetic match, and they had never heard of the name or story tied to the identity he carried. Those brief exchanges did not bring answers, but reinforced a new awareness that the issue was not system error, but that his origin story had been missing a crucial part from the start. While he was still grappling with those thoughts, the DNA connections continued to expand and cross-reference in the system, gradually sketching a biological relative network, whose center was not where he lived, but pointed toward another area, with longer established and more fully documented family records. As stronger connections began appearing, pattern recognition algorithms determined that his DNA sequence had significant similarity to individuals from the same lineage, originating in Alabama, information meaningless to him, but of special weight in the missing persons data management system. At the interagency data level, these matches were automatically compared to cold cases involving missing children, whose identities remained unresolved after many years, and it was here that a rare intersection began to form. The disappearance file of Charles Coleman, which had lain dormant in storage for more than 2 decades, unexpectedly reappeared on the list of cases potentially related to the new DNA data, not due to direct evidence, but because indirect biological links had exceeded statistical thresholds to be flagged for review. The backward link to Alabama did not occur as a conclusion or accusation, but as a technical signal, a note in the system indicating the existence of a consumer DNA sequence matching the Coleman family's genetic structure, though the current identity of the sequence owner did not match any previously confirmed records. For the man with the different identity, the information that his genetic connections clustered around Alabama created an indescribable chill, as it suggested the possibility that his life might have begun in a completely different place from what he had believed. and that the prolonged silence of many years was not random, but the result of a real break in the flow of identity. He began realizing that the DNA test, done for purely medical reasons, had inadvertently opened a door he could not close, as those numbers and connections could not be denied or explained away by personal feelings. On the system side, flagging the Charles Coleman file did not mean the case was immediately reopened, but it ended the state of absolute silence it had been in for years, bringing it back into potential attention for authorities, if legal and procedural conditions allowed. No calls were made, no public announcements issued, but that status change held deep meaning, as for the first time in years, the case no longer existed only as a forgotten file, but became one with the potential to connect to a living person, operating under a modern identity in society. For that man, the consumer DNA turning point did not bring immediate answers, but it shattered the fragile balance he had maintained, forcing him to face the reality that his origins were not just a personal question, but might involve a larger story, buried by time and silence. And in Alabama, though no one yet realized what was changing, within the data system, the Charles Coleman case had been flagged again as an unresolved possibility, quietly awaiting the next steps that could bring a truth lost for many years back into the light. The flagging of Charles Coleman's case file in the system did not immediately generate any external movement, but it was enough to trigger a silent chain of processes that only those working on cold cases truly understand, where every unusual signal is examined in the context of hundreds of cases that had similarly fallen into silence. Information about a civilian DNA chain with an indirect link to a family line in Alabama was forwarded to the state's cold case unit as data requiring evaluation, without any assumptions or conclusions attached, but sufficient to raise the question of whether the 2001 disappearance might have overlooked a critical avenue of approach. The cold case unit received the case with its characteristic caution, knowing that most signals of this kind lead to dead ends, but also that in the rare few instances, the truth sometimes emerges in ways no one could have anticipated. Charles Coleman's old file was pulled from storage, the first time in years it was fully reopened, not just to reread the reports, but to place them alongside the new data that had just surfaced, in an effort to find intersection points that either did not exist before or could not be identified at the time. The cold case investigators began by reviewing all the original documents, from the initial report intake forms, search maps, and witness statements to the strategic investigative decisions made in the early days after Charles vanished, this time with a different perspective, unbound by time pressure or initial assumptions. As the civilian DNA data was placed alongside the old information, a central question gradually took shape. If Charles had not met with an accident in the local area and had not left voluntarily, then the possibility that the boy had lived for years under a different identity might have been undervalued, or even dismissed too early. The comparison of new and old data did not occur as a direct match, since DNA could not immediately confirm identity without a reference sample, but it served as an orienting marker, forcing investigators to revisit details once deemed insufficiently significant. Conflicting witness statements about strangers and vehicles noted in the file were reanalyzed, no longer viewed under the assumption that abduction was unlikely, but examined as pieces that might have been misinterpreted in the original context. Previous decisions, particularly the deprioritization of the abduction hypothesis and the focus on local searches, were dissected not to assign blame, but to understand how the context, experience, and technological limitations of the time had shaped the investigation's direction. The cold case unit recognized that some critical intersections might have been missed, not because they did not exist, but because they did not fit the assumptions dominating investigative thinking at the time, causing them to be marginalized or not pursued to their conclusion. The reanalysis of old decisions also revealed gaps in interstate and federal data linkage in the early 2000s, when systems were not sufficiently synchronized to allow comparisons of missing children records with newly emerging identity records in other jurisdictions. In that context, the possibility of a child being taken out of state and raised under a different identity was not impossible, but lacked the tools to effectively prove or disprove it, resulting in the hypothesis not being fully pursued. The civilian DNA data, though not yet sufficient for a conclusion, provided the cold case unit with something the original investigation lacked: an objective anchor point to expand thinking beyond the geographic and administrative boundaries of the case. When investigators cross-referenced the genetic links with lists of unresolved child disappearances from the same period, Charles Coleman's case emerged as one with a high degree of fit, not because of the volume of evidence, but because of the nature of the disappearance and the absence of any final resolution. The decision to reopen the file was therefore not made as an emotional reaction to the new data, but as the result of an evaluation process showing sufficient factors to re-examine the case in light of modern technology and investigative methods. The formal investigation was quietly restarted internally, with a small dedicated team assigned to work the file, review all data, and determine feasible next steps without compromising the legal integrity of the process. This restart was not accompanied by public announcements or media involvement, as the cold case unit understood that any information released too early could have unintended consequences, especially when the identity of a living individual might be connected to the case. Instead, they chose a cautious step-by-step approach to verify data, rebuild the timeline with new assumptions, and prepare for the possibility that the case was not simply an unresolved disappearance, but a story of stolen identity and existence outside the system's reach for many years. In the process, the investigators clearly felt the difference between reading an old file as historical documentation and approaching it as a live case, where every detail could take on new meaning when placed in a different context. Charles Coleman's file, once considered a dead end, was now viewed as a collection of decisions, assumptions, and limitations of an era, being challenged anew by the data and tools of the present. Reopening the cold case did not guarantee that the truth would be found, but it marked a significant shift. The case was no longer confined to silence, but had returned to active consideration, with the potential connection between past and present becoming clear for the first time. And though at that moment no one in the cold case unit could be certain they were facing a true breakthrough, the formal restarting of the investigation laid the groundwork for a new chain of events, where what had once been overlooked had a chance to be revisited, not through the lens of 2001, but with the awareness and tools of a world that had changed profoundly. Reopening the file not only allowed the cold case unit to pursue new directions, but also required them to go back to the very beginning of the entire matter to systematically examine what had happened in 2001, not to find individuals to blame, but to understand how a series of decisions that seemed reasonable in their context had inadvertently created blind spots that lasted more than 2 decades. The entire initial process was placed under review, from the moment the report was received, the way the case was classified, the methods of collecting and preserving information, to the allocation of resources between field searches and criminal investigation, this time without the pressure to act quickly, analyzed in a static state with full knowledge of what had and had not happened afterward. The cold case investigators noted that from the very first hours, Charles Coleman's disappearance had been placed in a rigid evaluation framework, where the absence of clear signs of violence and the existence of less dangerous hypotheses had unconsciously deprioritized the possibility of abduction, even though no evidence was strong enough to rule it out entirely. Systemic decisions, such as concentrating resources on local searches and delaying federal expansion, were re-evaluated in light of the recognition that the 2001 system lacked flexible mechanisms for handling child disappearances that might extend beyond local boundaries, anchoring all actions to administrative lines. Reviewing meeting minutes and internal reports, The cold case unit realized that many decisions did not stem from lack of concern or individual competence, but from deeply ingrained operational templates, where cases were handled according to familiar scripts to avoid community panic and exceeding available resources. The jurisdictional blind spot gradually emerged as a key factor, with the case handled almost entirely within Oxford and surrounding areas, while possibilities involving interstate movement or identity change were hardly taken seriously, not because they did not exist, but because they exceeded local authority and coordination capabilities at the time. The lack of effective interstate data sharing, combined with the absence of synchronized national systems for missing children, made any hypothesis crossing administrative boundaries difficult to pursue, inadvertently reinforcing the belief that the answer, if it existed, had to lie within controllable range. Pressure from the community and local media was also identified as a strong influencing factor on decision-making, as police had to balance the need to reassure the public with maintaining an open investigation involving more frightening scenarios, leading to a tendency to prioritize assumptions that caused less short-term disruption. The cold case unit noted that resource shortages, both personnel and technology, had forced 2001 investigators to make pragmatic choices, such as focusing on large-scale search operations, rather than investing in deep analysis of conflicting statements or pursuing faint leads involving strangers, because those paths required time and expertise they lacked. When current investigators placed those decisions in a broader context, they saw that each individual choice, justifiable at the time, contributed to a chain of interconnected errors, where deprioritizing one hypothesis led to missing clues reinforced the initial assumption, and the loop continued until the case reached complete stalemate. In particular, the failure to establish a long-term tracking mechanism for possibilities involving identity change or interstate movement was seen as a structural shortfall, reflecting the limitations of investigative thinking before DNA technology and national databases became widespread. Documents showed that although there were occasional mentions of the possibility that Charles had been taken out of the area, they were never developed into a formal investigative direction, partly due to lack of evidence, partly due to no tools for verification, and partly due to no clear legal mechanism to effectively expand the scope. The impact of time pressure was also analyzed in depth, as initial investigators had to make decisions under incomplete information, knowing that each passing hour reduced the chances of finding the victim, forcing them to choose actions that could be implemented immediately, even if they might not be the best long-term direction. The cold case unit did not view these errors as personal failures, but as consequences of a system operating within certain limits, where the combination of pressure, resource shortages, and outdated technology created an environment prone to short-term decisions. Identifying the chain of interconnected errors was therefore not about rewriting history with present-day judgment, but about understanding how small blind spots could accumulate into a large gap, large enough for a child to disappear from the identification system for years without detection. This review process also helped the cold case unit identify core lessons, such as the importance of maintaining multiple parallel hypotheses, the necessity of interstate coordination mechanisms in child disappearance cases, and the risk of allowing public pressure to unconsciously shape investigative direction. As each decision was re-examined in light of the new data, current investigators not only saw what had gone wrong, but also what had been missed, small opportunities that once existed but were never connected into a clear path. Reviewing the 2001 investigative errors thus became an indispensable step in restarting the case, as it allowed the new investigation to be built on a foundation of deep understanding of past limitations, rather than unconsciously repeating them in different form. And while nothing that happened could be changed, the frank confrontation with the chain of interconnected errors opened the possibility that this time, With more modern tools and fuller awareness, the truth about Charles Coleman would not remain trapped in the gaps that the old system could not overcome. Clearly identifying the systemic errors in the 2001 investigation provided the foundation for the cold case unit to move into a more proactive phase, where the focus was no longer on local searches, but on tracing the trail of a life that may have left Alabama very early, crossing jurisdictional boundaries that the original investigation could not reach. Residency and medical records became the most logical starting point, as these are systems that record an individual's existence in ways less dependent on memory or statements, and often leave long-term trails. Investigators began by reviewing primary medical records, showing anomalies, particularly cases of young children appearing in healthcare systems in other states, without a local birth history, or with inconsistent guardian information in the early years. This process was not aimed at finding a direct match, but at identifying patterns, repeating points that might suggest a child had been taken to a new place, and gradually legitimized over time. When these records were cross-referenced with the recorded civilian DNA data, certain cases began to stand out as points of interest, not because they matched perfectly, but because they existed in similar administrative gaps. In parallel, school records were brought in for analysis as another key data source, since a child starting school typically involves registering personal information, guardians, and residences, creating timeline markers that can be compared with other data. The cold case unit reviewed old enrollment records across multiple states, focusing on cases where children began school without clear prior records, or with sudden changes in name or guardian in the early elementary years. This was time-consuming work requiring interstate coordination, as most of these data were not fully digitized in the early 2000s, forcing investigators to approach local systems individually, request access, and cross-reference manually. Gradually, some pieces began to come together, not enough to confirm identity, but enough to reconstruct a hypothetical movement path, where a child left Alabama shortly after the disappearance and reappeared in systems elsewhere under a new identity. Reconstructing this movement path was not based on a single route, but on the layering of many small data points: the earliest appearance in medical records, the first enrollment marker, recorded address changes in administrative forms, and the gaps where no data existed at all. Investigators realized that these very gaps, where an individual left no official trace, held special significance, as they could reflect transition periods when the old identity was severed, and the new one not yet fully established. Determining the time of departure from Alabama became a key objective, as it allowed narrowing the investigative scope and eliminating incompatible hypotheses. By comparing Charles's disappearance date with the earliest appearances of suspicious records in other states, the cold case unit gradually narrowed down a plausible time window, not a specific day, but a short enough period to indicate that interstate movement happened quickly, rather than as a result of prolonged local events. Connecting these critical timeline markers allowed investigators to see a continuous flow, where Charles's life did not vanish, but was redirected onto a different trajectory, parallel to the silence of the Alabama file. Each data point, when placed side by side, held little meaning on its own, but when linked, they began to tell a different story from the one the original investigation had believed. Notably, no single marker was decisive alone, but their consistency in sequence and movement logic created a picture clear enough for the cold case unit to believe they were on the right track. Tracking interstate movement also highlighted challenges the 2001 system could not overcome, as the lack of interstate data connectivity allowed a child to be administratively reborn, without triggering any alerts. Current investigators realized that without DNA data, and cross-disciplinary analysis capabilities, these pieces would have remained isolated forever, never connected into a meaningful path. As key timeline markers were identified and linked, a new working hypothesis gradually formed, not as a final conclusion, but as a reference framework for continued investigation. Charles Coleman left Alabama within a very short time after disappearing, was taken through at least one other state before his new identity was solidified, and began appearing in administrative systems as a completely different person. This hypothesis not only explained Charles's prolonged absence from local records, but also aligned with irregularities in the identity of the man now living under another name, as well as the recorded civilian DNA matches. Tracking interstate movement was therefore not just a technical step but a fundamental shift in how the case was viewed, moving the focus from what happened in Alabama to what happened after leaving Alabama. When investigators completed mapping the hypothetical movement path, they did not treat it as final proof, but as a foundation for further verification, gradually closing the gap between the data and the real person living at the end of that path. In that context, interstate movement was no longer a vague possibility overlooked, but became the central axis of the restarted investigation, where each connected timeline marker not only filled past gaps, but also brought the Charles Coleman case closer to moving from hypothesis to confirmation, from data to person, and from long silence to a truth gradually emerging. When the interstate travel pattern was reconstructed with a consistency sufficient to rule out coincidence, the cold case unit understood that they had reached the boundary between hypothesis and reality, where every subsequent step had to be taken with absolute legal precision, as any error could unravel the entire process that had taken years to build. The official collection of DNA samples became the top priority, no longer relying on civil data for reference purposes, but fully complying with forensic procedures to ensure validity within the justice system. The investigators coordinated with authorities in the state where the man living under a different identity resided, approaching the matter cautiously to avoid any elements that could cause psychological harm or violate personal rights, while ensuring that the sample collection was conducted on a voluntary and transparent basis. The DNA sample was collected under strictly controlled conditions, sealed, fully documented, and transferred directly to the designated forensic laboratory, where the analysis process was conducted independently to eliminate any possibility of error or interference. Concurrently, the cold case unit contacted Charles Coleman's biological family in Alabama, who had lived for years in a state of unresolved waiting, to request reference DNA samples, a decisive but highly sensitive step, as it forced them to confront the possibility that the final answer could both bring hope and reopen old pain. Comparing with the biological family's records was not just a matter of matching biological data, but also a process of reviewing previously stored genetic information, including samples collected for exclusion purposes during the initial investigation phase, now brought to light with entirely different significance. When the official DNA samples were submitted for analysis, forensic experts conducted multi-layered comparisons, not only confirming direct blood relations, but also examining extended genetic markers to ensure the results could not be confused with any other relationship. This process took place in tense silence, where all parties involved understood they were facing a moment that could permanently alter how the case was perceived, yet no one dared to predict before the official conclusion. When the absolute confirmation results were returned, they did not come as a story or emotional interpretation, but as a dry report with numbers and near-absolute probabilities, stating that the DNA sample collected from the man under the different identity fully matched the Coleman family's genetic profile, ruling out any possibility of random coincidence or technical error. In that moment, the Charles Coleman case officially crossed a critical threshold, shifting from prolonged suspicion to a reality confirmed by forensic science, where the identity of the child missing since 2001 was no longer a hypothesis but an undeniable fact. The case status change was implemented immediately thereafter in the internal system, updating the cold case file from identity unidentified to confirmed victim alive, a rare transition in the history of long-term missing persons cases, reflecting the exceptional nature of this one. This change was not merely administrative, but opened a series of new legal and investigative consequences, requiring authorities to adjust their approach and classification of the case across all related databases. Internal notifications were sent to relevant units at the state and federal levels, presenting a concise yet comprehensive summary of the confirmation results, the steps taken, and the limitations to be observed in the next phase, particularly regarding the protection of the personal information of the newly identified individual, until necessary procedures were completed. There was no press release, no public statement, because the cold case unit understood that this truth, though significant for justice, was first and foremost a profound shock to the people involved, and needed to be handled with utmost caution. Within the law enforcement agencies, the confirmation result created a noticeable shift in atmosphere, as investigators who had previously viewed the case as historical records, now had to face the reality that the victim not only existed but was alive, living a life that had formed beyond the system's reach for many years. Internal meetings focused on assessing the implications of the forensic results, from updating federal records to determining jurisdiction for handling subsequent aspects of the case, all conducted with the understanding that any misstep now could cause irreparable harm. For the cold case unit, the forensic identity confirmation was not an endpoint but the beginning of an entirely different phase, where the focus was no longer, where is Charles Coleman, but how has Charles Coleman lived, and what happened to separate his identity from his biological family for so many years. However, internally, they allowed themselves to acknowledge the special significance of this moment, as it was rare for a long-term missing persons case to reach such a clear conclusion without a confession or the discovery of remains. Forensic science, in this instance, had accomplished what time, witnesses, and traditional investigation could not, connecting two seemingly unrelated lives into a single identity, confirmed by irrefutable data. And as the documents were updated, signatures completed, and the case status officially changed in the system, the cold case unit knew they had just passed a historic milestone in the case, where the truth was no longer in speculation but officially recorded, opening a new chapter with profound consequences for all those affected by Charles Coleman's disappearance, whether in Alabama or anywhere else. The forensic confirmation of identity forced the investigation into a more substantive phase, where the central question was no longer who Charles Coleman was, but what truly happened in the early days after the boy disappeared, and why an abduction could persist for years without detection. As the cold case unit began reviewing the entire data chain from this new perspective, one thing quickly became clear: the motive behind taking Charles away from Alabama showed no signs of financial crime or ransom kidnapping, as no ransom demand was ever made, no suspicious transactions were recorded, and there was no evidence suggesting direct material gain as the goal. Instead, the facts gradually pointed to a more personal, complex, and harder to classify motive, where the abduction was not about seizing money but seizing a child's life itself. Identity deprivation became the central element in understanding the case's nature, as Charles was not only removed from his biological family, but also severed from all administrative and social ties associated with his original name, a process requiring preparation, system knowledge, and persistence over many years. The investigators noted that the new identity was not created randomly or hastily, but built gradually through outwardly legal procedures, from medical and educational records to residency, indicating that the person or persons involved had the ability to understand how the system worked to avoid detection. In clarifying the roles of individuals involved, the cold case unit faced a complex reality. Many links in the chain of events had occurred too long ago. Involved individuals may have changed, passed away, or lacked sufficient data for full tracing. What remained were mostly indirect traces, administrative decisions made on behalf of a child, unable to protect his own rights, and a series of actions that, taken individually, might not constitute clear crime, but when viewed together, revealed a deliberate process to erase the original identity. Determining each individual's role became difficult, not only due to the passage of time, but also because the line between criminal behavior and exploiting system loopholes at that time was not always clear. Some actions, when viewed under current legal standards, might be considered serious, but in the early 2000s context, they fell into gray areas of regulation, where inconsistencies between states and lax oversight allowed the new identity to form without triggering alerts. This led to an unavoidable legal reality. Although the case fully embodied the elements of abduction and identity theft, the possibility of criminal prosecution was severely limited by statutes of limitations, lack of direct evidence, and the fact that some actions had been legitimized through administrative procedures without clear signs of fraud under the legal standards of that era. The Cold Case Unit had to acknowledge that clarifying the abduction's nature did not equate to bringing all involved individuals to justice, as the justice system is not designed to perfectly handle behaviors spanning decades and multiple jurisdictions. In this context, assessing responsibility became both a legal and ethical challenge, as investigators had to distinguish between those actively involved in the identity deprivation and those who were merely passive links, acting within their limited understanding. Some individuals may have believed they were doing the right thing, or at least not fully aware of the long-term consequences, while others likely understood that severing a child from his biological family was profoundly harmful, even without physical violence or financial motive. The absence of evidence that Charles was physically abused during the years under the different identity further complicated the case assessment, creating an ethical paradox, where a child was both the victim of a serious crime and someone raised in an environment that was not entirely negative. However, the Cold Case Unit emphasized that the lack of physical violence did not diminish the criminal nature of identity deprivation, as its psychological and social consequences are long-lasting and irreversible, forcing a person to live a life that is not their own for decades. The investigators also had to confront legal limits on prosecution, as many actions had passed the statute of limitations or lacked sufficient elements for charges under current law, making pursuit of criminal accountability nearly impossible. This did not mean the case was considered crimeless, but highlighted the difference between establishing historical truth and applying legal sanctions in the present, two goals that do not always align. In internal reports, the Cold Case Unit clearly distinguished between investigative conclusions and prosecutorial feasibility, noting that although not all involved could be brought to trial, clarifying the abduction's nature remained vitally important for the victim, biological family, and society, as it affirmed that what happened was not a random disappearance or accident, but the result of a deliberate chain of actions. Responsibility assessment was thus conducted on multiple levels, from the direct responsibility of those involved in removing Charles from Alabama, to the indirect responsibility of systems that failed to detect or prevent it in time, and finally, to society's responsibility in protecting children from scenarios lacking traditional violence. Clarifying the abduction's nature did not provide the full satisfaction of a criminal conviction, but it played an essential role in closing a story spanning over 2 decades, where truth had been obscured by silence and systemic gaps. For the Cold Case Unit, this phase marked a shift from pure investigation to confronting difficult questions about justice, responsibility, and the limits of the law, as not every clarified case can end with proportionate punishment. And while the abduction's nature was clarified through data, analysis, and legal evaluation, one undeniable reality remained: Charles Coleman had been deprived of the right to grow up with his true identity, a loss that no administrative decision or investigative conclusion could fully compensate. But naming the true nature of what occurred was still a necessary step for justice, however delayed and incomplete, to be acknowledged. Once the nature of the abduction had been clearly established within the investigative agencies, the focus immediately shifted from uncovering the truth to managing the human consequences of that truth, as unlike cases ending in convictions or closed files, this one presented an entirely different challenge: how to enable two sides of a family, separated for over 2 decades, to face each other without causing further irreversible harm. Recognizing this extraordinary sensitivity, the Cold Case Unit formally requested the involvement of FBI Victim Services, a unit specializing in supporting victims in cases with profound psychological impact, with experience handling situations where legal elements cannot be separated from human ones. The involvement of FBI Victim Services was not formalistic, but central to assessing, coordinating, and overseeing the entire preparation process for the potential meeting, ensuring every decision was based on the long-term best interests of the individuals involved, rather than pressure to close the file or external expectations. The team's first task was to evaluate the psychological states of both sides, a process conducted separately and cautiously, as although both were oriented toward the truth, Charles Coleman and his biological family had lived entirely different lives, carrying different forms of trauma. For Charles, learning that his entire identity had been built on a prolonged deprivation was not only shocking, but directly threatened the stability he had worked to maintain for years, requiring experts to carefully assess his readiness before any contact with the past. For the biological family, especially the parents, the psychological state carried a different tone, where hope thought extinguished was suddenly reignited, bringing the risk of emotional overload as joy, pain, anger, and loss surged simultaneously without time to process. FBI Victim Services determined that without thorough preparation, the meeting could become a severe psychological shock for both sides, rather than the start of a healing process, as unmanaged expectations and emotions could lead to uncontrollable reactions. Based on these assessments, a safe contact plan was built step by step, not aiming for a dramatic moment, but minimizing emotional risks and protecting each individual's right to self-determination. The plan clearly stated that the meeting, if it occurred, was not a legal or moral obligation, but a personal choice, and that either side had the right to delay or refuse, if not ready. The participating psychologists focused on helping Charles and the biological family understand that the truth, though important, did not require them to immediately assume the roles society often assigns to reunions, where tears and embraces are seen as a perfect ending. Managing emotional risks became a central task, with scenarios prepared for various possible reactions, from prolonged silence or emotional numbness to strong responses like anger or panic, all anticipated with immediate support plans. FBI Victim Services also emphasized that initial contact did not have to be a direct meeting, but could start with less direct forms, such as handwritten letters, moderated messages, or exchanges through intermediaries, to create a safe bridge before face-to-face encounters. Alongside psychological factors, legal and medical conditions were thoroughly reviewed, as identity confirmation did not automatically erase existing legal consequences in records, and any contact had to ensure no impact on privacy, personal safety, or ongoing legal obligations. Consulting attorneys were brought in to ensure the meeting, if it happened, was not misinterpreted as accepting or waiving any legal rights, and that all shared information remained voluntary, without coercion or exploitation. Medically, experts assessed the overall health of the parties, especially older biological relatives, as sudden emotional stress could pose serious risks if uncontrolled, so every scenario accounted for possible immediate medical intervention. Throughout this preparation, the Cold Case Unit maintained a supporting and coordinating role, avoiding direct interference in personal decisions, as they understood that from the moment identity was confirmed, the case was no longer just an investigative file, but a complex human story, where every choice could leave lasting marks. No specific timeline was set for the meeting, as FBI Victim Services recommended that forcing progress could cause more harm than benefit, and psychological readiness does not follow administrative schedules. Individual counseling sessions continued, focusing on helping each side define personal boundaries, realistic expectations, and the right to control their own pace, rather than chasing idealized reunion images. For Charles, this process helped him gradually separate accepting the truth about his origins from deciding the degree of connection with his biological family, two things not necessarily simultaneous or in the same direction. For the Coleman family, it helped them understand that their son's survival did not erase the lost years, and that any rebuilt relationship would start from zero, with patience and mutual respect. Preparing for the meeting was thus not just the final step before a symbolic moment, but a long, careful process to protect people who had already suffered too much from the very truth they were trying to face. And while from the outside, all eyes awaited a reunion, within the support system, the sole priority was ensuring that when two worlds once torn apart met again, it happened in safety, agency, and respect. So the truth, instead of becoming a new wound, could have the chance to serve as the foundation for long-term healing. After a lengthy preparation process involving close collaboration with FBI Victim Services and psychological experts, the moment for the final meeting was determined not as a performative milestone, but as a cautious step to bridge the gap that had existed for over 2 decades. The chosen location was a neutral space, unconnected to traumatic memories or overly symbolic, private enough to avoid external disruptions while still ensuring the necessary medical and security conditions for all participants. The meeting room was arranged simply, with soft natural light, and no symbols of investigative agencies, to minimize the feeling of being monitored and allow emotions to unfold as naturally as possible, though every procedure was tightly controlled to prevent situations exceeding anyone's tolerance. Before the official meeting began, each person was taken to a separate space to stabilize emotionally, with experts reminding them that there were no mandatory expectations, that all reactions were valid, and that anyone had the right to stop if feeling overwhelmed. When the door between the two spaces was opened, the meeting sequence proceeded exactly as planned, without simultaneous appearances or surprise moments, but through slow, deliberate steps, allowing each side time to recognize and adjust to the reality unfolding before them. Charles entered first, his gait somewhat slow, his gaze both probing and cautious, carrying the tension of someone facing an origin he had only known through files and accounts, never through vivid memories. On the opposite side, the Coleman family sat in silence, faces aged by the years but still bearing traces of prolonged waiting, where hope and fear intertwined, as they understood that the man entering was no longer the 5-year-old boy from their memories, and that this reunion could not erase the lost time. The moment their eyes met did not unfold as an immediate emotional explosion, but as a prolonged silence, where each seemed to search for a familiar point in unfamiliar features, a small sign that could confirm the blood connection truly existed before them. Emotional reactions varied greatly, with no immediate crying or outbursts, but quiet tremors shown through rapid breathing, clenched hands, and reddening eyes as awareness gradually set in that this moment was real, no longer hypothetical or part of an investigation report. Charles stood still for several long seconds, feeling as if all the questions about himself that had smoldered for years surged at once, while his biological parents struggled to restrain the urge to rush forward and embrace their son, having been prepared that physical contact should only occur when both sides were truly ready. Psychological experts closely observed every small movement, ready to intervene if any signs of overload appeared, while avoiding disruption of the natural flow of emotions, knowing that excessive control could make the moment feel artificial. When the first greeting was spoken, it was not formal or complete, just a simple phrase with a slightly trembling voice, enough to break the wall of silence and allow emotions to flow gradually. Direct identity confirmation was not done through official declarations, but through small personal details, body marks, habits or memories shared carefully, enough for both sides to recognize the connection that forensic science had already confirmed. A small birthmark, a familiar gesture when stressed, or the pronunciation of a local word that Charles had no idea of its origin, all became vivid pieces reinforcing that the link existed beyond paper. The emotional climax did not come from a dramatic act, but from the moment initial restraint gave way to acceptance, when tears began to fall unrestrained, and the physical distance between them narrowed naturally, without a preset script. The first hug, when it finally happened, was brief, not fully cathartic, but like a silent confirmation that they stood before each other not as strangers, nor yet as a complete family, but as people sharing a starting point severed by circumstances and time. In that moment, emotions were not just the joy of reunion, but also profound regret for the lost years, for birthdays not celebrated together, unshared memories, and a childhood spent in parallel worlds unaware of each other. Experts noted that this complex mix made the reunion authentic, reflecting the true nature of meetings after long separations, with no perfect endings or instant healing, but only a door open for the parties to decide how to proceed. No official statements were made in that room, no cameras or media lenses, as all understood this moment belonged not to the public or files, but to those who had carried the story for years. When the meeting ended at the agreed time, no one felt it was fully closed, but rather like a new chapter beginning, where truth was confirmed by both reason and emotion, and each left with a burden lifted, yet carrying new questions and feelings needing time to process. That reunion did not erase what happened, nor automatically heal all wounds, but created a rare intersection between past and present, where a missing child from long ago and an adult man today coexisted for the first time in the same space, the same truth, and the same moment that for over 20 years, no one was sure would ever happen. The moment the door closed after the meeting did not bring a sense of closure, but left a prolonged silence, where each person emerged into a completely different reality than when they entered. And in that silence, the profound consequences of the new truth began to reveal themselves clearly. Adapting to the confirmed identity did not happen as a smooth transition, but as a continuous clash between what had been lived, what had been lost, and what had just been returned, forcing Charles Coleman to confront a fragmented self that for years he had only sensed as a vague misalignment. The new identity did not erase the old one, nor could it simply overlap, leaving him in prolonged inner conflict, where truth provided answers but also shook the psychological foundation he had relied on to survive. At times he felt relief that his sense of displacement was no longer groundless, but soon after came emptiness upon realizing that found origins did not automatically bring belonging, as most of his life had been built in a different context, with irreversible relationships, memories and choices. Accepting himself as Charles Coleman meant learning to live with two parallel streams of memory, one cut off at age 5, the other continuing unaware of the first, creating subtle conflicts in how he viewed himself, family, and the concept of home. For the biological family, the reunion's impact spread in equally complex ways, as joy at recovering their son was quickly overshadowed by the painful awareness that they faced an adult man, not the child they had waited for over 2 decades. The blood bond remained, but it was not enough to fill the void of lost years, making every conversation feel both intimate and distant, sacred yet fragile. Charles's parents had to learn to restrain the desire to compensate, as any attempt to pull him back into the role of the son from their memories risked harming both sides, since the relationship could not rewind time but only start from the present. The unbridgeable time gap became an invisible but ever-present entity, weaving into unasked questions, unshared memories, and life milestones passed in silence, creating a lingering sadness without clear form but hard to dispel. Yet acknowledging that gap helped both sides ease the pressure to make the reunion a perfect story, allowing them to approach the new relationship with necessary honesty and caution. Life after reunion thus unfolded not dramatically, but slowly through small contacts, short conversations, and carefully considered meetings, prioritizing presence over expectations. Charles continued the life he had built, not as denial of his biological family, but to protect his current identity, while gradually familiarizing himself with his origins, while the Colemans learned to be present in his life non-invasively, accepting that affection could not be forced or accelerated by blood alone. Charles's inner conflicts did not vanish, but evolved into deeper questions about how he wanted to define himself going forward, whether to change his legal identity, where the biological family fit in his life, all decisions without absolute right answers. For the biological family, their son's survival did not bring the complete closure they had imagined, but opened a new phase of waiting, learning to love without possession, be present without imposition, and accept that finding did not mean reclaiming. Psychological experts continued supporting both sides, focusing on minimizing secondary trauma, as post-reunion emotions are often more complex and unpredictable than before, since truth was now part of daily life. Over time, small changes emerged, not in obvious touching moments, but in how they listened more, accepted silence when needed, and let the relationship grow at its own pace. Some days Charles felt closer to his biological family, other periods he needed distance to process surging emotions, and the Colemans gradually understood that fluctuation was not rejection, but a natural part of adaptation. Life after reunion thus existed in limbo, not the unresolved tragedy of a missing person, but not a complete reunion story either. A long journey where each learned to live with the confirmed truth. The most important thing was not whether they became a traditional family, but whether they could exist in each other's lives with respect, patience, and the right to choose, as ultimately, truth had brought them to the same starting point, but the path forward could only be built through voluntary steps and understanding. The confirmed truth did not close the story like a typical case, but instead opened deeper questions, where what had been clarified only made the untouched parts clearer and heavier in the awareness of both the family and those involved in the investigation. The true perpetrator of the kidnapping, though identified in role and actions, left a large gap in deep motive, as records only showed the surface of the decision to take Charles from Alabama, not fully explaining why someone believed they had the right to strip a child's identity and life, not for money, not clear personal grudge, but in the name of a subjective belief in what was right. Investigators could reconstruct actions, determine the event chain, and conclude the legal nature, but the deep psychology, where moral consciousness was distorted enough to allow long-term harm, remained beyond absolute verification. No full confession, no diary, or internal documents explaining motive formation, only inferences from behavior and context, leaving the boundary between moral self-delusion and criminal intent an open issue without definitive conclusion. This raised serious questions about similar cases, as the Charles Coleman case revealed a dangerous but overlooked scenario: kidnappings without traditional violence, no ransom, no clear traces, carried out quietly by exploiting administrative gaps and lack of system integration. If a child could be taken, given a new identity, and live years without triggering alerts, the question was not just how it happened, but how many undetected cases exist where victims never even suspect their origins. Internal experts acknowledged this case might be the tip of a rare but real issue, especially in an era before deep DNA and data integration in civil management, making detection rely almost entirely on chance or victim initiative. System responsibility thus became unavoidable, as while no specific individuals in 2001 administration could be blamed, the case exposed serious blind spots in how federal child data, residency, and identity agencies operated. Lack of cross-verification, no alerts for a missing child in one state reappearing in another under new identity, showed the system inadvertently enabled prolonged identity theft, though not intentionally. This raised broader questions about collective responsibility, not just law enforcement, but the entire civil management structure in protecting the most vulnerable, especially children unable to speak for themselves. Meanwhile, unverifiable details remained, permanent gaps in records erased by time, limiting truth reconstruction to a certain degree. The first hours after disappearance, what people saw but were unsure to report, administrative decisions based on incomplete info, all left unanswerable questions. No one could pinpoint exactly when Charles left Alabama, the initial route, or key psychological moments shaping the identity shift, as physical evidence was lost, witnesses forgot or gone, and human memory could not fill gaps with needed accuracy. Even Charles, carrying the whole story, retained only fragmented memories, insufficient for coherent reconstruction, making his experience both living proof and a reminder of memory limits under prolonged trauma. The case's aftermath thus lay not in resolved identity, but in how it echoed in the involved parties' awareness and the broader legal system. For the Colemans, each unanswered question was lingering pain, and an inevitable part of the truth they had to accept, as finding their son did not mean fully understanding everything. For Charles, open questions became part of self-definition, learning to live with incomplete answers, accepting some things forever out of reach, though he was the center. For investigators, it left deep professional resonance, not just the rarity of finding a living victim after years, but forcing reconsideration of basic assumptions about crime, victims, and system response to non-standard scenarios. Unanswered questions were thus not failure, but the most honest part, reflecting that justice does not always mean completeness, and clarifying a case sometimes only highlights insurmountable limits. In the remaining silence after files updated and reunion occurred, these questions persisted as a persistent reminder that some truths can only be approached to a degree, the rest eternal echo, not to close but enough to make society reflect, stay vigilant, and change. The case's open questions did not diminish the confirmed truth's value, but placed the entire investigation in a broader context, where the significance of DNA and modern investigation emerged as key to breaking decades-long silence. In Charles Coleman's case, DNA was not just a scientific tool, but the only remaining bridge between seemingly unrelated lives, allowing truth to transcend human memory limits, faded witnesses, and forgotten files. Modern investigation, with federal data matching, genetic analysis, and cross-time information connection, proved a case does not truly die when closed on paper, but sleeps until the right tools appear. Thus the value of preserving records became clear. Without old papers and seemingly meaningless data saved, no technology could work. This case showed every small detail, insufficient for breakthrough initially, could become a future key in proper context with new methods. Preservation is not just administrative duty, but a long-term justice commitment. Acknowledging current knowledge and capability are not always enough, and keeping past traces is the only way to enable future correction. Meanwhile, lessons from system failures stood out, not to blame individuals or deny 2001 investigators' efforts, but to highlight how jurisdiction limits, technology, and federal coordination inadvertently created gaps for prolonged identity theft. A child disappearing in one state and reappearing elsewhere under new identity undetected reflected alarming system fragmentation, where units did their part, but lacked the holistic view needed to protect the most vulnerable. The lesson was not finding who was wrong, but recognizing safety requires systems designed to question the seemingly valid, flag mismatched data, and prioritize integration over isolation. Justice in Charles Coleman's case came late, not as a verdict or fitting punishment, but as truth returned to the right person, name, and place in their history. It was incomplete, unable to restore lost childhood, erase the biological family's hopeless waiting, or resolve all ethical and legal questions. Yet late justice has its own value, affirming truth is not fully buried by time. Past wrongs can be acknowledged and corrected, though never perfectly. In true crime, where the public is drawn to perpetrators, violence, and drama, this story stands apart, reminding that not all crimes are bloody, and not all tragedies end in death. Sometimes the deepest harm is stripping someone's right to know who they are, forcing a life not their own unknowingly. The case's closing message is not sensational, but a quiet warning about society's responsibility for memory, data, and people. It emphasizes every archived file is not just paper, but a life waiting to be heard, every tech advance only meaningful when serving truth and human dignity, and justice, though late, can create change with enough patience and determination. The story closes not with absolute satisfaction, but deeper awareness of modern investigation's limits and potential, DNA's power as a silent but enduring witness, and the value of not abandoning seemingly forgotten cases. In true crime, where entertainment and reality blur, Charles Coleman's case reminds that behind every headline are real people, with real pain, and lasting consequences beyond any story's length. At the intersection of science, memory, and social responsibility, late justice still finds a voice, not to close everything, but to affirm that truth, protected long enough, ultimately has a chance to be found. Charles Coleman's story shows that in today's United States, safety is not just locking doors or warning kids about strangers, but how families and communities respond in the first hours when something unusual happens. In Oxford, Alabama in 2001, Charles vanished without clear violent signs, leading police to initially downplay kidnapping, focus local searches, hit dead ends, and turn it into a cold case. The practical lesson: if your child goes missing, immediately record the exact last seen time down to the minute, clothing, nearby people, and any strange vehicles. People, don't let memory get distorted by panic and rumors like the conflicting witnesses here. Also, proactively demand authorities activate appropriate federal-state search mechanisms and expand scope early, as jurisdiction blind spots let Charles leave Alabama without timely blocks. For families adopting or with inconsistent background records, the story reminds that valid paperwork does not always mean clear origin. Charles grew up under a different identity, and only a civil DNA test for medical reasons uncovered distant relatives, reviving the forgotten file. So in modern life, where DNA testing is common, treat genetic data as prevention, update family history, ask thoroughly about child medical school records, and seek professional help for anomalies, instead of suffering alone. Finally, the reunion shows late justice still brings trauma, so when facing major truth, prioritize emotional safety like the FBI Victim Services model, step by step, respecting boundaries, and accepting lost time cannot be made up with one hug. If you believe seemingly forgotten cases still deserve to be heard and truth found, subscribe to the channel to follow more cold cases awakened by time and technology. Thank you for staying until the end of Charles Coleman's story, and see you in the next video, where another truth awaits discovery.